Hi, and welcome to Code Corner. This is a video series we do at Mayfield Renewables where we talk about codes and standards as they relate to the solar and energy storage industries. Today we're going to jump into the 2026 National Electrical Code. So we've got a new version of the code released, and we're going to talk today specifically about 705.11. So that's source connections to a service. That's our supply side connections when we're taking a PV system or a distributed generation system and connecting it to the supply side of a main breaker inside of a facility. And specifically going to talk about within that section the overcurrent protection requirements. In 2026, you will see that we've actually reduced the number of subsections in 705.11. If you go back to 2023, we had, I believe it was 6 of them, and now we're down to 3 of them in 2026. But today we're going to focus in on this overcurrent protection section. And just for a little reference to point you back to where you were at in 2023, this is where we were at in subsection F for overcurrent protection back in 23. The interesting thing to note here is that the 2026 language is going to look a lot like the 2020 language. And this is something that for folks doing these types of connections, notice that we had this, really what it comes down to is this distance requirement for our overcurrent protection. In 2020, we had very specific requirements for how far we could go with our conductors before we had overcurrent protection. In 2023, those requirements went away, and we were applying the code more like a typical service in the sense of the distance requirements and really the fact that there aren't distance requirements for those conductors. But in 2026, we've gone back and we actually are really looking at very similar language as what we had in 2020, actually almost identical in a lot of ways. So the words may have changed a little bit, but the way that we're applying it is really going to be the same. And so going back to those requirements. So with this, I would just point out to folks that we have this time period, this 2023 version that is, we changed the methods from 20 to 26. And so if you are one of those folks you're watching this video and you're trying to get a heads up or an understanding of what's going on in 26, but you're still under the 23 or the 23 code or even maybe the 20 code, it may behoove you just to kind of stick to those 2020 rules, even if you're in the 23 code, just because they're going to be more restrictive actually. And I think you have some code cycles to point to and would be able to say we're meeting these distance requirements, and there's not going to be any problems with jurisdictions allowing for those. So with that, let's look at the actual language itself. I'm not going to necessarily read this to you, but for those of you familiar with 2020, this is going to look very similar, very familiar for you. And really what it comes down to is these distance limitations for our conductors. I'm going to show you a couple images in the upcoming slides on these as well. So if you want to take a pause, video, read the code language, you can. But what we are getting to here is dwelling units. So 1 and 2 family dwellings, we are going to be limited to 10 feet of conductor length or 3 meters of conductor length from the point of connection to that overcurrent device. And so that is the actual conductor length. That was in older versions of code, we had similar requirements and it was never quite clear. Is that the conductor length? Is that how you pull a tape measure? Is that the amount of pipe you get to get, that kind of stuff? Very clear here that we have 10 feet of conductor from point of connection to that overcurrent device. If you are in other than a dwelling unit, then you get 5 meters or 16.5 feet. So it's that same kind of idea. We're making a point of interconnection or we're connecting to those conductors in some fashion, and how you're actually making that connection, that's another topic in of itself. But from that point, the conductor length, depending on where you're at, what type of building you're in, then you get these distance limitations. The thing to note here is, I'm picking up on this language in 2026. You'll notice in that charging language for C1, so we're in 705.11 C1, and that charging language says power source service conductors located within buildings and connected to service conductors. So this is going to be true for conductors that are within buildings. And so that's going to be a big thing. We're trying to avoid having unprotected conductors inside buildings is a big part of this for why we're seeing these overcurrent devices being required. There is an informational note. Interesting here, just talks about, we're providing guidance for practical distances for these unprotected conductors. Again, kind of to that same point, we want to minimize the amount of unprotected conductors within the buildings. And so we want to be able to make sure that we're limiting those distances so we don't have any issues if there are faults within those conductors inside the buildings themselves. So here's that first image I was referring to. So this is actually something we were using back in 2020, and it's coming to life again. So really what this is saying is if we're in a dwelling unit, then that conductor length has to be less than or equal to 10 feet. So from that point of connection inside that main service panel there, we are running over to a PV system disconnect, and that conductor length is the 10 feet. As you can imagine, 10 feet of conductor length gets eaten up pretty quick as soon as you have bends and turns, and you're going to have 90s, and you're going to have to come out of this thing, and you're going to have to mount this on the wall. So physically, you're pretty limited on the space that you are confined within. So that 10 feet it's a pretty small amount of space. You don't get a lot of extra wiggle room there to put that disconnect and that overcurrent device somewhere remote from the point of connection. The other one is these non-dwelling units, other than dwelling units. And so this is where we get the 5 meters or 16.5 feet. So really it's the same kind of concept. We just get a little bit longer distance. You're in a commercial industrial facility or something like that. So it's not a huge amount of extra distance you get, but you do get some. And so that can be helpful for those applications that we're doing. So again, conductor length limited to that 16.5 feet in this specific situation. And then the last point I want to talk about for this new 2026 70511C1 is this under engineering supervision. So this is actually something, we had this in 2020 as well. So the actual implication or the actual way that we put this into practice really hasn't changed from those older code versions, I should say. But the way that it's talked about here, it says under engineering supervision, if you're in other than a dwelling unit, then you need to install in accordance with the following. And it lists 2 requirements for the following things that we have to do. So here you see in A that we have, again, that 5 meter limitation. And this time what it's saying is within that 5 meter limitation, you need to have a cable limiter per ungrounded conductor. So each of your hot conductors that you're installing, you need to have cable limiters installed on those, and it gives you somewhere within the switchgear or similar enclosures. So again, we have that distance limitation where we have to put it in, and then on top of that, we need to have an overcurrent protection device within 20 meters of conductor length, so 66 feet from that point of connection. So if you cannot get your overcurrent protection device within that 5 meters, like I showed in this last slide, you need to put a cable limiter in those 5 meters, and then within 20 meters of that point of connection, you need to have an overcurrent device. So this will be your disconnect with a fuse or something like that inside of it. So again, this is really reverting back to those 2020 language requirements. And really this is the same as what we saw before, but a little bit different language, a little bit different words around it, but really we're going to have to do the same things to meet this code requirement. All right, so that's going to do it for our 705.11c in the 2026 code. I encourage folks to take a look at our website. We have a number of courses that offer for different topics for the solar and energy storage industries, covering a wide variety of code topics, standards, talk about feasibility studies, things like that. So take a look and see if there's something that we might be able to help you out with on your education there. And then finally, always love to hear from folks. If you want to reach out, you can, here's some ways that you can get in touch with us. If you have a question on this or other code corners, or if there's a topic that you're wanting to hear about, let us know. Always love to hear from you. And so appreciate your time, and we'll see you at the next Code Corner.